The billionaire noticed the little girl hiding bread inside a paper napkin only seconds before the restaurant manager seized her father by the arm. Every head in the elegant dining room turned toward the weary man standing beside the table, yet nobody moved to help him. His faded work shirt was streaked with dust. His shoes were splitting at the seams, and shame had drained every trace of color from his face. Beside him, his daughter clutched the wrapped bread against her chest as though it were something precious. Across the room, billionaire businesswoman Saraphina Vale stared at the father and felt her heart stop because she recognized the look in his eyes. It wasn't the fear of being embarrassed. It was the terror of a parent realizing he had failed to feed his child. That bright Saturday afternoon had begun as an ordinary outing for Saraphina and her 9-year-old son, Callum. Saraphina owned Vale Meridian Holdings, a global logistics and property empire that had made her one of the wealthiest women in the country before she turned 40. Business magazines described her as disciplined, fearless, and almost impossible to surprise. Her employees knew her as a woman who could walk into a failing division, spot every weakness within the hour, and rebuild it before her competitors even noticed there had been a problem. Yet success had brought her little peace. Since her husband's death 4 years earlier, she had buried herself in work and surrounded Callum with tutors, drivers, security officers, and expensive gifts. She told herself she was giving her son everything. But lately she'd begun to notice that he smiled more at the groundskeeper than at the costly toys delivered to their mansion. Callum had asked to eat somewhere ordinary that day. He didn't want a private dining room, a personal chef, or a restaurant where every employee knew his mother's name. He'd pointed through the car window at Bellwether Grill, a cheerful family restaurant near the edge of downtown, and asked if they could have lunch there. Saraphina nearly refused. She had a conference call scheduled, but the hope on his face made her close her phone. They arrived early in the afternoon, when sunlight poured through the wide windows and families crowded around polished wooden tables. Callum ordered a cheeseburger and fries. Saraphina ordered a salad and coffee, though she barely tasted either as messages kept flashing across her screen. At a smaller table near the kitchen sat Rowan Mercer and his 7-year-old daughter, Juniper. Rowan was 35, though exhaustion had carved lines around his eyes that made him look older. He'd once worked as a structural engineer for a respected construction firm, designing schools, community centers, and affordable apartment buildings. He'd believed hard work would give his family stability. Then his wife fell seriously ill. Rowan took unpaid leave to care for her, sold their house to cover medical bills, and borrowed money until there was nothing left to borrow. She died 11 months later, leaving him with grief, debt, and a daughter who woke at night calling for her mother. When Rowan tried to return to his profession, the company had already replaced him. His former colleagues offered sympathy, but no position. He took whatever temporary labor he could find, mending fences, unloading delivery trucks, cleaning warehouses on the night shift. That morning he'd spent 6 hours hauling broken concrete from a renovation site. The supervisor had promised to pay him at noon, but once the work was done, the man claimed there'd been a misunderstanding and told Rowan to come back Monday. Rowan had $11 in his pocket. Still, Juniper had scored perfectly on her spelling test and had spent the week talking about celebrating with pancakes. Bellwether Grill advertised a Kids Eat Free promotion, and Rowan figured he could manage one meal for himself while Juniper ate for nothing. He hadn't eaten since the previous afternoon, but he planned to order the cheapest thing on the menu and give most of it to her. Once they sat down, though, the waitress apologized and explained the promotion only applied after 5 in the evening. Rowan's face fell. He studied the menu while Juniper traced pictures with her finger, chattering about everything she wanted to try. Finally, he ordered one grilled cheese sandwich with a side of soup and told the waitress they'd share it. Juniper didn't complain. She'd learned too early how to read the worry on her father's face. When the food came, Rowan cut the sandwich into 4 pieces and set 3 on her plate. He said he wasn't hungry, though his stomach cramped with emptiness. Juniper pushed one piece back toward him. He pushed it gently back to her. To anyone glancing over, it might have looked like a small game between father and daughter. But Saraphina saw Rowan drink 2 glasses of water while pretending not to look at the food. She saw him smile every time Juniper took a bite, and she saw the girl quietly wrap the last piece of bread in a napkin and slip it toward her pocket. Callum noticed too. He stopped eating and asked his mother why the man was giving away all his food. Saraphina looked up from her phone and watched Rowan, and something uncomfortable stirred inside her. She remembered being 12 years old, long before the wealth in the boardrooms, when her own mother worked 2 jobs and sometimes claimed she'd already eaten so Saraphina could finish her dinner. She'd learned years later those had been lies told out of love. Success had buried those memories under marble floors and private planes. But the sight of Rowan's untouched plate brought them rushing back. Before Saraphina could act, the restaurant manager approached Rowan's table. The payment terminal had declined his card twice. Rowan checked his pockets and realized the $11 he'd been carrying were gone, probably lost at the work site or somewhere on the walkover. He quietly asked if he could leave identification and return later with payment. The manager, already irritated by a full dining room, accused him of trying to skip out on the bill. Rowan lowered his voice, hoping to spare Juniper, but the manager only spoke louder. Heads turned. Someone lifted a phone, maybe to record the humiliation. Juniper's small face tightened. She reached into her pocket, pulled out the wrapped bread, and set it on the table, as if returning it could erase the bill. That simple gesture broke something loose in Saraphina. She stood so fast her chair scraped the floor. Her security officer started forward from near the entrance, but she raised a hand to stop him. She crossed the dining room, set her black credit card on Rowan's table, and told the manager the family's bill was hers. Rowan refused immediately. Pride was one of the few things hardship hadn't taken from him. He thanked her but insisted he'd handle it himself. Saraphina looked at Juniper, then at the bread sitting in its crumpled napkin, and told him this wasn't charity. Her son had noticed that he'd given away his lunch even while he was hungry, and she wanted Callum to see that kind of generosity honored, not ignored. Rowan's eyes drifted to Callum, standing beside his abandoned plate with a worried look. After a long, painful silence, Rowan accepted, but only on the condition that he'd pay her back. Instead of returning to her own table, Saraphina asked the waitress to bring fresh meals for everyone. She expected another round of refusal, but Callum was already carrying his fries over to sit beside Juniper before either adult could object. Within minutes, the 2 kids were deep in conversation about school pets and the strange shapes of the clouds outside. Juniper laughed for the first time all day. Rowan ate slowly, embarrassment written into every careful movement. Saraphina sat across from him and listened as he explained, without asking for pity, how he'd ended up there with no intention of cheating anyone. When he mentioned his engineering background, she went still. One of her companies had recently halted construction on a low-income housing project after inspectors found serious structural flaws. The original consultant had vanished, executives were pointing fingers at each other, and the project was bleeding thousands of dollars a day. She asked what kind of structures he'd designed. He answered with easy technical precision. Affordable modular buildings built to withstand severe weather while keeping maintenance costs low. As he spoke, his posture changed. The defeated laborer disappeared, and for a few minutes she saw the skilled professional he'd once been. She pulled a folded project rendering from her portfolio, the one she'd meant to review over lunch, and asked, without explaining where it came from, whether anything looked off. Rowan studied it for less than a minute before pointing to a load distribution error near the foundation. Saraphina's company had paid a consulting firm nearly $200,000, and yet this man had caught the flaw in a family restaurant with soup on his sleeve. She asked how sure he was. Rowan borrowed a pencil from Juniper's school bag and worked through the numbers on a paper placemat. His conclusion matched the confidential report she'd received the night before. For the first time, Rowan really looked at her, the watch, the tailored suit, the security officer waiting nearby, and recognition dawned slowly. He'd seen her face in the business news. His expression shifted from surprise to discomfort as he realized he'd just lived through the most humiliating hour of his life in front of one of the richest women in the country. He stood to thank her again, ready to leave before pity turned into something larger. Saraphina stopped him and asked him to come to her company's headquarters Monday morning. Rowan assumed she meant some minor maintenance job and said he'd take any honest work. She shook her head. She didn't need another laborer. She needed an engineer who could see what her highly paid experts had missed. Rowan admitted his license had lapsed. He couldn't afford the renewal fees or the continuing education. Saraphina told him those were obstacles, not endings, and handed him her card. The interview would start at 9. Monday arrived clear and bright. Rowan borrowed a jacket from an elderly neighbor and took 2 buses across the city, reaching Vale Meridian's glass headquarters 40 minutes early. The lobby alone seemed bigger than his whole apartment building. Employees in polished shoes moved past while he sat with his hands clasped tight, half expecting someone to tell him he didn't belong. At 9 sharp, Saraphina's assistant brought him upstairs. The interview wasn't gentle. She placed him in a conference room with 3 senior engineers who had no idea how she'd found him. They pressed him about the gap in his resume, challenged his assumptions, and asked him to analyze the troubled housing project. His nerves faded the moment the blueprints appeared. For 3 hours he walked through the flaws, proposed fixes, and sketched a redesign that would save the project without tearing down what had already been built. 2 of the engineers pushed back. Rowan calmly worked through the math until their objections ran out. Saraphina offered him a 6-month consulting contract, enough to renew his license, clear his most urgent debts, and move Juniper out of the unsafe apartment they'd been living in. Rowan stared at the contract, struggling to find words. He didn't ask for more money. He asked whether the company had any child care program, since Juniper's school let out early. Saraphina glanced through the glass wall at Callum, finishing his lessons with a tutor in the adjoining lounge, and realized that while her company offered executive wellness perks and private dining rooms, plenty of employees further down the ladder struggled just to look after their kids. Rowan signed the contract. But what Saraphina did next went far beyond hiring one man. She had an unused section of headquarters converted into an affordable child care and learning center for every employee, including temporary workers. She started an emergency meal program so no employee's child would go hungry over a delayed paycheck. And she launched a return-to-career program for skilled parents who'd left the workforce to care for sick family members. Rowan was its first participant, but not its last. Over the following months, Rowan rebuilt more than his career. He worked days, took licensing courses in the evenings, and spent every spare hour with Juniper. His redesign saved the housing project and made it safer. Saraphina promoted him to lead engineer after he caught another costly flaw the senior team had missed. He never forgot the restaurant, though. Every payday, he took Juniper back to Bellwether Grill and quietly paid for some struggling family's meal before slipping out. Callum changed too. He and Juniper grew close, and through her he learned happiness didn't require private jets or expensive gifts. He started asking his mother to spend Saturdays at parks, libraries, and community events instead of shopping centers. Saraphina went along reluctantly at first, then realized how much of her son's childhood she'd nearly missed. She began leaving the office before sunset twice a week and put her phone away during meals. The company kept thriving. Her home slowly warmed back up. A year after their first meeting, Saraphina invited Rowan and Juniper to the opening of the finished housing community. Hundreds of families gathered under a bright afternoon sky as children ran between newly planted trees. The development included safe apartments, a community garden, and a child care center modeled after the one at Vale Meridian. A plaque near the entrance credited Rowan as lead structural engineer. A smaller plaque nearby carried Juniper's name. It marked the community meal hall, where any child could get a healthy lunch without being questioned, embarrassed, or turned away. During the ceremony, Juniper handed Saraphina a small framed paper napkin. Inside was a simple drawing of 4 people sitting around a restaurant table. Underneath, she'd written that the best day of her life began the moment she thought everything was falling apart. Saraphina held the frame to her chest as her eyes filled. She understood then that she hadn't rescued Rowan. Rowan and Juniper had rescued something in her that wealth had slowly buried. The reminder that kindness isn't a transaction, and that seeing someone else's pain comes with a responsibility. Rowan stood beside her, no longer in borrowed clothes, no longer lowering his eyes in shame. He told her that the lunch she'd bought had fed them for one afternoon, but the chance she'd given him had restored his daughter's faith in tomorrow. Saraphina answered that his last sandwich had taught her son more about character than any private school ever could. As the afternoon light settled over the new community, Callum and Juniper ran toward the meal hall together. Saraphina watched them disappear through the open doors while Rowan stood quietly at her side. For most of her life, she'd believed that anything extraordinary required enormous wealth, influence, or power. But that day she finally understood the truth. Sometimes the most extraordinary thing a person can do is simply notice the one everyone else has chosen not to see, sitting beside them in their hardest moment, and give them not just help, but the chance to stand proudly again.